Good morning. How are you? You're all very welcome. Can you hear me? You can hear me okay? Great. I'm Jacqueline Hall. I'm chair of the Irish Georgian Society, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this morning to this unique Daniel O'Connell Study Day. You're very welcome, and thank you for your attendance. Lord Mayor, Councillor Brendan Fitzgerald and Councillor Bobby O'Connell, who I know are due here from Kerry County Council, the Irish Georgian Society partners, supporters, guests and fellow members of the Irish Georgian Society. We're here today at this unique event to mark the 250th anniversary since the birth of Daniel O'Connell. And it gives me particular pleasure also to welcome Johnny Cunningham and his wife, Natalie, who Johnny is a great-great-great-grandson of Daniel O'Connell. I hope I've got that right, and it's great to see you here today. You're very welcome. For those of you who are familiar with our work or not familiar with our work, our mission is to promote and protect Ireland's built heritage, designed landscapes and the allied arts. We were established in 1958 by Desmond Guinness, and today we have 1,800 members with chapters in Cork, Birr, Limerick and London, as well as a very active Irish Georgian Society USA, which is headquartered in Chicago. Today, this morning, we're particularly pleased to welcome you to our home, the City Assembly House, which, as the Lord Mayor will allude to, has a direct connection to Daniel O'Connell. This beautiful building served as the meeting place of Dublin Corporation for the first half of the 19th century, and also as the unofficial City Hall, including when Daniel O'Connell was Lord Mayor of Dublin in 1841. The City Assembly House is still owned by the successor of Dublin Corporation, Dublin City Council, who is our landlord. We are on a long lease, now 14 years into a 30-year lease. In 2011, the Irish Georgian Society, in partnership with Dublin City Council, launched a fundraising drive for the project, and after a first phase of works, moved into the building in 2013. And we completed the project with the opening of this exhibition room in 2018. We were successful in raising over 2.3 million through the financial support of our members in Ireland and abroad, and as well from our valued partners in Dublin City Council, the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, and the Heritage Council. Central to our restoration of the City Assembly House was the goal of using it for cultural events. So in this building, on average, we host 10 to 15 art exhibitions every year, and they're open, all of them are open to the public. We also hold up to 40 lectures, seminars, training programs and events for our members and for all of those with an interest in learning about and preserving Ireland's built heritage. This doesn't happen alone. We couldn't do it without the support of others. And I'd like to thank a few this morning who've helped us on this way. We're particularly grateful for the very constructive partnership with Charles Duggan, the Heritage Officer of Dublin City Council. Today's event is the most recent in several successful collaboration and conservation outreach collaborations that we've undertaken. Charles, who's here today, many thanks to you and your colleagues in Dublin City Council for this greatly valued partnership. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the State's Commemorations Advisory Committee of the Department of Culture, Communications and Sports for their contribution in making this study day a reality. Equal thanks are also due to the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage for their ongoing support of the conservation education programme, of which this study day is an essential part. Scott Hayes of Ecclesiastical Insurance is here today. Scott, you and your colleagues have been long-term supporters of the Irish Georgian Society, and they have provided generous funding for today's proceedings. Ulster Architectural Heritage have been our partners in the development and delivery of this particular event. Sincere thanks to its chairman, Dan Kelly, for this very productive collaboration. I'd like to thank all of the speakers for their generosity with their time and with sharing their knowledge and their perspectives. I'd like to acknowledge the work and thank Emmeline Henderson, who's the IGS Conservation Manager and Deputy Director, for organising today as part of the Society's Conservation Education Programme. Emmeline has been involved in this for over 6 months. She's like the swan. She's always absolutely perfectly calm, but a huge amount of work goes in the background. And I'd also like to acknowledge the contribution of our Executive Director, Donald Cahill, and his team here. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the Lord Mayor of Dublin, Councillor Ray McAdam, the 358th Lord Mayor of Dublin, who will officially launch today. Lord Mayor, thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Yes. Fantastic. Jacqueline, thank you very much for that introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, scholars and friends, and in particular I want to acknowledge Johnny Cunningham. Johnny, it's great to see you again. We caught up at the annual Daniel O'Connell lecture in Glasnevin Cemetery earlier in the year, so Johnny, it's great to see you. It is a privilege to join you all here today in City Assembly House as we mark 250 years since the birth of Daniel O'Connell, a giant of Irish history, a champion of democratic rights, and a man whose legacy continues to shape the city and the country we are all proud to call home. And for me personally, to deliver this speech as a successor as Daniel O'Connell as Lord Mayor of Dublin. We meet in a room that is not just a venue, but a witness to history. This was the chamber in which O'Connell himself presided as Lord Mayor of Dublin in 1841, the first Catholic to hold that office since 1690. Not just a personal achievement, but a national turning point. Born in Cahersiveen in 1775, raised in the shadow of the penal laws, educated in France, trained as a lawyer, shaped by both Enlightenment thought and the violence of revolution, O'Connell became the architect of a new form of political struggle. A struggle not grounded in force, but in moral force, in persuasion, in mass participation, in democracy. It was that conviction that led him to declare with absolute clarity, and I quote, "Nothing is politically right that is morally wrong." That single sentence, still powerful 2 centuries later, speaks to the kind of leadership that recognises that power is only legitimate when rooted in principle, and that the centre, the democratic centre, must hold, not by accident, but by conscience, by courage, and by collective will. O'Connell proved that when ordinary people organise peacefully and purposefully, they can move the machinery of history. Through the Catholic Association, founded in 1823, he mobilised millions, raised the first national political fund, and created the first mass democratic movement in the world. And in 1829, he achieved something many believed impossible: Catholic emancipation. But his vision was never narrow. His concern was never only for one community or one cause. He spoke out for the rights of Jewish citizens in Europe. He denounced slavery in America and the Caribbean. He believed in dignity without borders, liberty without qualification, and democracy without violence. And yet, Daniel O'Connell was not only a national figure, he was a Dublin figure, a civic leader, a Lord Mayor who understood the power of ceremony, symbolism, and public space. He knew that the city itself could be a stage for change, its streets, its monuments, its institutions. Which brings me to the theme of my mayoralty this year, celebrating Dublin. Because to celebrate Daniel O'Connell is, in a very real way, to celebrate Dublin, the city he helped reshape, the city whose democratic character he embodied, the city whose story he helped write. And so, as Lord Mayor today, I draw a direct line from his civic leadership to the three pillars of my mayoralty today: a living city, an active city, and an engaged city. O'Connell believed that a city should reflect the dignity of its people, not in marble alone, but in how people lived, how they worked, they worshipped, and participated in public life. From Goldenbridge Cemetery to the Assembly House where we stand, to the monuments that still define O'Connell Street, he reshaped the physical, the cultural, and symbolic landscape of Dublin. Today, we carry that legacy forward, restoring public monuments, reimagining the capital core, tackling vacancy and dereliction, and renewing Dublin not by erasing its past, but by building on it. A living city is one where heritage is not a museum piece, but a shared inheritance. O'Connell mastered the art of peaceful mobilisation. He understood that democracy is not theory, but movement. He gathered hundreds of thousands at monster meetings. He filled the streets. He activated the public realm. It was participation, not passivity, that changed Ireland, which is why we're reminded that the altar of freedom is never safe, but when it is watched by the people. Today, our work to create an active city through public space, active travel, safer streets, sports access, and civic gathering places is rooted in that same belief. Cities belong to people when people can move, walk, meet, play, protest, and celebrate together. Perhaps O'Connell's greatest gift was not a law passed, nor a title earned, but a culture of engagement. The belief that every citizen has a voice and a role in public life. That democracy is not something done to people, but done with people. And that idea lives on in our work today, from disability inclusion to cultural participation, to protecting local democracy, to building a Dublin where every person can see themselves not as a spectator, but as a stakeholder. An engaged city is not just governed, it is co-authored. And we are here today to study O'Connell through architecture, designed landscapes, and visual culture. And that really matters, because monuments, buildings, and public spaces do not only reflect history, they teach it. They shape how we remember, how we imagine, how we belong. And as Lord Mayor, I'm proud that the City Council has now prepared a conservation management plan for every public monument and sculpture on O'Connell Street, including John Henry Foley's great O'Connell Monument, unveiled in 1882 before a crowd of over 500,000 people. A restoration not only of stone, but of meaning. And I want to acknowledge the partners who have made today's event possible: the Irish Georgian Society, Dublin City Council's Heritage Office, and the Ulster Architectural Heritage. Your scholarship, your conservation work, and public engagement ensure that O'Connell's legacy is not just preserved, but understood, debated, and renewed. And so finally, I return to the man himself. The great movements he led, the democratic principles he shaped, the city he served, the moral centre he held. I believe he once said, "My heart is Irish, my heart is in Dublin." Those words speak not only to affection, but to duty. The duty of every generation to protect the democratic space that others fought to build. The duty to keep the centre strong, not by silencing difference, but by deepening participation. The duty to ensure that Dublin is not only a capital, but a community. If Daniel O'Connell proved anything, it is that history does not move by accident. It moves because people decide that dignity matters, that democracy matters, that the centre can and must hold. And so as we honour him here today, we must also, I believe, recommit ourselves to a Dublin that is living, active and engaged. A Dublin where history is not only remembered, but used. A Dublin that is proud of its past, confident in its present, and unafraid of its future. So let us continue the work he began, not with nostalgia, but with purpose. Let us build a Dublin worthy of its people, worthy of its promise, worthy indeed of the next 250 years. Because, like O'Connell, we believe in a city that belongs to all, a city led with principle, a city where every single voice counts, a city that celebrates itself, not just in memory, but in action. That is the city I am proud to serve. That is the Dublin we will all build together. Gurmí Makov.
And thank you very much, Lord Mayor, for your wonderful remarks. I'm Charles Duggan, the Heritage Officer in Dublin City Council, and I have the very easy job of chairing the first session today. The first session is called Daniel O'Connell and Dublin's Buildings. The first session focuses on O'Connell's relationship with the fabric and symbolism of Dublin itself. Our speakers will consider how he used civic ceremony and public ritual to project power and inclusivity, and how his memory was enshrined in the architecture and monuments that followed. Unfortunately, Dr. Olivia Hurley is unwell and unable to join us today, but her planned paper on Goldenbridge Cemetery is gratefully acknowledged as part of the programme. We'll begin with Professor David Fleming from the University of Limerick, who will discuss O'Connell and civic ceremony, symbolism and politics, followed by Dr. Jacqueline Eleanor Hayes, whose paper explores the Daniel O'Connell Funerary Monument in Glasnevin Cemetery. By way of introduction, Professor Fleming is based in the School of History and Geography at the University of Limerick. He's a specialist in social and political development of 18th century Ireland. His research spans provincial politics, poetry, religious conversation, associational behaviour and prostitution. He is currently examining the role of ceremony and symbolism in early modern Irish state. So his paper today is called O'Connell and Civic Ceremony, Symbolism and Politics. Will you please welcome Dr. Fleming to the podium. Thank you.
Thanks. Lord Mayor, colleagues, friends, I'm delighted to be the first person to speak, and as Charles has said, I am speaking about O'Connell's use of symbolism and politics that the Lord Mayor has already referred to. And O'Connell, for those of you, I think all of us here will know, was the consummate showman, using large-scale spectacle to great effect in mobilizing and emboldening his supporters, as well as demonstrating to opponents his popularity. And spectacle was used to convey subtle images, subtle political messages, sometimes not so subtle messages, through the use of particular symbols. When we think of O'Connell, of course, we think of greyhounds and round towers and all of that. I'm not going to speak about those today. I'm just going to speak about civic symbolism when he was Lord Mayor of Dublin in 1841. And when he was elected in this room in November, and happily it is still November, he used the opportunity to deploy official forms of civic ritual for his own purposes and for political purposes. Sometimes we can think of the elements of ceremony, and we saw lots of ceremony yesterday with the inauguration of President Connolly, as often timeless, just things that are done, shorn of current politics, without political meaning. But this is far from the reality. Many ceremonial events could and were, and probably still are, used for political purposes. And in doing so, in 1841, O'Connell was no different to anybody else. One of the prominent civic spectacles in Dublin was the inauguration of a new Lord Mayor. On the 30th of September, the Charter stipulated the day on the 30th of September each year. And this involved a procession of the Mayor and Mayor-elect, along with the sheriffs and the aldermen and the members of the Common Council, who assembled at this building, the City Assembly House, and went to Dublin Castle, preceded by the insignia of the corporation. You can see some of the insignia here, the Sword of State, the mace, the civic cap, which is up there over the arms, and missing from this particular one, the keys of the city. These were processed along with these dignitaries to the Lord Lieutenant. Here, the sword would be held aloft. The legal officer of the corporation, the recorder, made a speech before the Viceroy introducing the new Lord Mayor. The Lord Mayor then swore oaths, just like President Connolly did yesterday, to take up the office. And at that point, the collar or gold chain was invested by the Lord Lieutenant. A rather rare thing in this country, or even in Britain, because no other civic chief magistrate was given such an honour. I suspect the Cork Lord Mayor would have definitely wanted the opportunity, but alas, no. At this point, the City Marshal presented the keys of the city and the civic sword and the mace to the Viceroy, symbolising the King's possession of the city, and he immediately returned them to the city, a highly symbolic gesture. And once this was done, a senior judge addressed the Lord Mayor, instructing him, and it was always a him, of course, in the responsibilities and limits of mayoral power as chief magistrate of the city. And finally, to close off that ceremony, that ritual, the Viceroy made a speech and then the corporation withdrew. But this ceremony was wiped away with the 1840 Municipal Reform Act, which had paved the way for O'Connell and other Catholics across Ireland to enter high municipal office. The Act had broadened the franchise, and by doing so ended the dominance of the Protestant civic elite. The Act did not go into detail about how the mayor was inaugurated, but it did stipulate that an oath had to be taken in front of a minimum number of councillors, and therefore it was presumed that the old ceremony would be discontinued, as indeed it was. The last ceremony was the year before in 1840. The new council, which met here on the 1st of November, and all of my spectacles and rituals are happening in November, within a few days of each other. So it's really rather intense in that month in 1841. When the new council met here, it was dominated by O'Connell's supporters, not exclusively, but a significant majority, and he was elected. And at this point, it was his tailor who came through that door, rather than any official signatory, with the robes of office. The mayor today isn't wearing his robe of office, but there is the crimson scarlet robe, and he donned it, and the councillors cheered and applauded, we are told. It was the only symbolic item bestowed on O'Connell at that moment. The collar, I'll come back to that, and I'll come back to that. And I didn't know the Lord Mayor would stay, so, and if I hadn't, I would have asked him to stand up at this point and show off this magnificent collar. But the gold collar, the collar of SS, as it's sometimes called, was not yet available. And one newspaper has it that the old corporation had withheld it. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but it certainly wasn't available for O'Connell on the 1st of November. When the meeting concluded, and there was various other things done on that day, O'Connell went across up those stairs and into the aptly named O'Connell room, possibly not the upper floor, but I suspect the O'Connell room, now called the O'Connell room, where he went to the window and he was seen by the crowds that thronged William Street. At that point, he put on his cocked hat. The mayor is not wearing his cocked hat today, but that is the hat, the cocked hat, and you see the civic officers as well, the mace bearer, also wearing this. That wasn't actually an old symbol at all. I think it was a relatively recent innovation probably in the late 18th or the beginning of the 19th century. The crowd, here I will let O'Connell's biographer C.M. O'Keefe, writing in 1864, take up the account. A vociferous cheer of the most intense delight rose from the crowded street the moment the smiling multitude caught a sight of him. "Does not this hat become me?" asked O'Connell. A shout of joy that made William Street ring again answered the query. Then he said, "Maybe it does not." "He's the finest Lord Mayor we ever saw," exclaimed the delighted crowd. He really looked quite kingly in his gorgeous habiliments. Someone asked him if he proposed attending Mass in his Lord Mayor's robes. "No," he replied, laughing. The Emancipation Act forbids me to do that. The mayor may be a Catholic, but his robes must be Protestant. I'll come back to that, and that is significant. If O'Connell in his official robes and cocked hat delighted the crowd at seeing the first Catholic Lord Mayor since 1689, it was his state coach. This is the current city coach, civic coach. O'Connell's state coach had offered even more symbolic weight. He didn't use this coach. It wasn't common. It was common for mayors to acquire their own state coach. This coach would have been used on occasion, but often mayors, such as one of the Guinnesses later on, commissioned their own state coach. O'Connell did the same, and his decoration of his state coach attracted attention for often the grandeur. These coaches could often attract attention for the grandeur they could exhibit by the use of allegorical paintings. You'll see one of the paintings there. This was built in the 1790s. But O'Connell had his own, and this is the account of it. And I think it's important for the use of symbolism, the use of colour that he deployed. The colour is brilliant green, relieved with gold, and highly varnished. The hammer cloth and inside trimmings are the same two colours, and the ornaments that relieve it and the panels of the body, consisting of the civic cap and Mr. O'Connell's crest, a stag's head with antlers, are executed in metal of a suitable colour and are beautifully chased. The city arms with supporters, with collar of SS, gold chain, together with Mr. O'Connell's supporters, they're his heraldic supporters, and armorial bearings will be found printed upon the panels in their proper colours. They present a richness and beauty which only can be exceeded by the execution. It is only 16 days since the order was given, and the entire is of Irish manufacture. So the poor coachmaker had only 16 makers. Now, the coach was probably built, but the decoration had to be done in this time. If the election and Inauguration Day provided a glimpse of O'Connell in at least some of the symbolic trappings of office, the days following provided an opportunity for O'Connell to be seen in the full regalia. By the way, this is an image from 1836, and I think we're hearing from Professor Brick later on about caricature. I don't know if he's going to talk about this, but this is before he was Lord Mayor, and he's carrying his own train. Usually the train, his gown, might be carried by pages, so I think there might be something going on there. But it's in this full regalia later on that we see him in a few days' time. It had been customary for the Lord Mayor and the corporation to go in state, i.e. in full regalia, to Christchurch Cathedral on certain days of the year, including after the election of a mayor. O'Connell, however, as we have seen from the window, he himself pointed out that he was prohibited under the provisions of the 1829 Emancipation Act, Catholic Relief Act, which stipulated that mayors and civic officers could not attend any place of worship wearing their insignia of office other than the established church. Were they to ignore the provision, they would be fined £100 and, more importantly, forfeit the office they held. This was probably some consolation to those Protestant conservatives who felt that the Church of Ireland, as the established church, and the Constitution was in danger because of the rise of O'Connell and political Catholicism. For them, a mayor attending Mass in his regalia might have represented the emergence of a Catholic ascendancy in place of a Protestant one. But O'Connell, the lawyer, was adept at testing legal limits, and although he gave an ambivalent answer at the window when asked if he would attend Mass in his capacity as mayor, it was obvious that he had given some thought to the question, because 4 days later, on the 5th of November, the newspapers announced that O'Connell would attend a solemn high Mass of Thanksgiving the next Sunday. The newspapers on both sides of the political divide rode in on this particular question. The conservative Dublin Evening Mail exclaimed that a gloom would be cast over the proceedings without the civic insignia on display, while the pro-O'Connell Freeman's Journal cast the law as, and I quote, supremely ridiculous, as if the dignity was in the gown or the authority in the cocked hat. But O'Connell knew how important display and spectacle of this nature was. And on that Sunday, he donned the robe and cocked hat, but still not without the gold chain, and arrived at the Metropolitan Church, now called the Pro Cathedral on Marlborough Street, in his carriage, where he was loudly acclaimed. The streets were again thronged to see the spectacle. Was he about to break the law and attend Mass in his regalia? Well, once he stepped out of the coach and went to the porch of the church wearing his robes, he removed them and left them on a table in the porch and then went in to Mass. It was him using both the prohibition and the civic regalia to great effect. It was a very clever way of subverting the 1829 Act while giving the crowd what they wanted to see, a Lord Mayor dressed in his finery. When Mass was over, O'Connell again put on his robe and hat and proceeded in his carriage round Dublin and back to Marlborough Street, where he had lunch with the Archbishop. Thousands, the pro-Connellite newspapers reported, thronged the streets to observe the spectacle. It was pitched as a moment of triumph after centuries of persecution. For the conservative press, it was a gross and formidable outrage perpetrated on peace, on law, and on religion. For them, O'Connell's evasion of the law was an instance of cowardness. He had gone so far, but not far enough, unwilling to entirely break the law. Later, in January 1842, so a little bit later on now, he had Mass celebrated privately in his full regalia in the Mansion House for him and his family, he wearing the full regalia. Of course, the law did not stipulate that he couldn't attend. He could only not attend Mass in a place of worship, the Mansion House not being a place of worship. Anyway, citizens would have to wait another 10 days on the 17th of November before O'Connell was seen in the full regalia, that is, the gold chain. He obviously had got it back by that stage, if it indeed had been withheld, because he had been invited by the new Lord Lieutenant, Lord de Grey, the Earl de Grey, to a levee in Dublin Castle. This might have been some sort of echo of the former inauguration ceremony, though it might equally be viewed as simply the normal proceedings on such occasions. Nevertheless, it was the first time O'Connell went in a formal procession, so perhaps something like this, but not, he didn't walk, and none of these people walked, they went in their carriages. Here, at last, he wore the gold chain. Now the Lord Mayor is gone, so I can definitely put up his picture. He wore the gold chain presented to the city by King William III in 1698. Rather than refuse to wear it, which he could have done, he could have refused to wear it as a symbol of former Protestant ascendancy. O'Connell wore it to emphasize the victory he had obtained by being elected Lord Mayor. The Freeman's Journal, which, as you'll remember, poured a little bit of scorn on the robe and the cocked hat, kind of reversed their thinking once they saw him in his full regalia. And this is what they said on the occasion of his going to Dublin Castle. His lordship was attired in his, I'll get rid of the current Lord Mayor and maybe go back to that one. His lordship was attired in his magnificent, this is the Freeman's Journal now, magnificent and gorgeous robes of office, with the celebrated gold chain known by the appellation of SS, which is said to be valued at 4,000 guineas, and took particular delight in pointing out to those around him a gold medal attached to it. I'll bring back the current Lord Mayor because you can see the medal there, which is engraved the image of King William, of glorious, pious and immortal memory, of brass money, wooden shoes, etc., etc. These are all little slurs that the newspaper are casting on him at this point. It certainly is a strange circumstance, it went on, the newspaper went on, in the history of Ireland, that a man who devoted his entire life in extinguishing by every means in his power the bigotry and intolerance, which the name of that monarch was the watchword, should be the first Catholic chief magistrate entitled to wear those insignias of office which were never publicly displayed, but to insult the Catholics of Ireland. I think the newspaper itself is considering the significance of the wearing of this. Of course, he had not been seen at that window on his day of election with the gold chain, so maybe people thought he had not worn it out of choice. The sword and mace was borne in front of O'Connell for the first time, as well as the keys of the city, by those officers of the former corporation who continued to hold their offices for the time being. But if these men, the sword bearer, the mace bearer, and so on, pointed to some sense of continuity, there were also signs of change. The keys of the city no longer were tied up in an orange ribbon, and instead a new one of green had been procured. The ceremony of being presented to the Lord Lieutenant involved the Chamberlain announcing the Lord Mayor. The City Marshal with the keys, mace bearer and sword bearer preceded O'Connell through St. Patrick's Hall, and there they waited to be announced before being admitted to the presence chamber. At this point, the civic officers should have waited. They should have stayed in St. Patrick's Hall. But for some reason, they decided to precede the mayor into the Viceroy's presence. And for those conversant in court ceremonial, this was a big faux pas. And for some, they thought O'Connell was trying to upstage it, again, symbolically. O'Connell, by the way, when this was discovered, said it was a mistake, nothing to do with him. He was just following what he was being told. But we don't know. O'Connell might triumphantly wear his regalia in Dublin Castle and in the city, but he took it one step further in February 1842, when he attended the House of Commons in Westminster wearing the chain. And that was not normal. And What the Cork he was MP for Cork at this point. What the Cork people thought of this has not been recorded, but it certainly made a big fuss in London. But again, it was to highlight, I think, the prohibition of wearing the chain in other places, i.e. in churches, as the law had prevented him. But the law did not prevent him from wearing it at Westminster. Perhaps the most symbolic gesture that O'Connell made was the decision to repaint the statue of King William on College Green. That statue had been the focal point of Protestant celebrations for over a century, though had become contentious in the decades leading up to and beyond emancipation. Now O'Connell, in a gesture of magnanimity and reflecting his stated wish to be an impartial Lord Mayor, and I think we might hear from Professor Geoghegan about his impartiality or his attempts at impartiality, ordered the statue to be repainted, not to be taken down, not to be harmed. He went out of his way, actually, to ensure that one of the first motions before the council in this room was to, in a way, conserve it. You could say it was to be painted in a bronze-coloured thing, but there was another motive behind it, because the plinth was usually painted in orange and blue colours, and the remnants of these colours were still there. And so by taking the opportunity to repaint it, he was getting rid of those orange colours, but also sending out a signal that just as he was wearing the gold chain presented by that king, he was eager that the statue would not be touched. That was a sign of impartiality, but his critics, and I think they are a fair criticism, his critics, notwithstanding what he had said about impartiality, he decided to go to repeal meetings wearing the chain of office, so in his official capacity. And so I think that was going a little bit beyond that impartiality that he had indicated. To conclude, in many respects then, O'Connell used civic regalia. His use of civic regalia was very much a political strategy rather than a simple nod to the ceremonial. Rather than rejecting the use of the regalia and its powerful symbolism, as some of his supporters might have wished, O'Connell's appropriation of it ensured that he and Catholicism was placed on an equal footing to that which civic Protestantism had held. And that's the point. Catholics could be on an equal footing and could demonstrate their capacity to be leaders in society and to use that symbolism to get that message across. And as he was an expert in doing, as we have seen, O'Connell tested those boundaries and pointed to the apparent absurdities of the law, which prevented or limited the ceremonial role of the mayor attending Mass or any other place of worship, using the symbolism of that civic regalia to great effect. For Protestant conservatives, unsettled by O'Connell's actions, it was yet more evidence that he was partisan and a demagogue. Their words, they loved using that word. The other significant point of it all was that his mayoral election and his use of civic ceremonial came at a time when his campaign for repeal of the Act of Union was faltering. Thus, it provided an opportunity, the most significant since emancipation, for demonstrating that his efforts on behalf of Irish people was still advancing. These occasions, therefore, provided an opportunity to mobilize and to retain that popular support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Fleming. That was a deeply interesting presentation. Our second speaker today is Dr. Jacqueline Eleanor Hayes. Dr. Hayes is an independent scholar who graduated in the history of art from the University of London in 1975. She later completed her postgraduate studies in the History of Art department at UCD, earning a master's degree in medieval studies in 1985 and a PhD in 2014. Her doctoral research, supervised by Professor Paula Murphy, examined funerary monuments in the 19th century garden cemeteries of Glasnevin and Mount Jerome. Dr. Hayes has also contributed to the Royal Irish Academy's Art and Architecture of Ireland series with an essay on cemetery sculpture. So would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Hayes to give her paper, The Daniel O'Connell Funerary Monument in Glasnevin Cemetery, Its Design and Significance. Very nice to meet you.
This is the O'Connell Monument, and that picture is really to show the monument in relation to the objects around, so that emphasises its height. The circle at the bottom of the monument is around or in a circle, and then to the left you can see this, the mortuary chapel, because I will be speaking about those things. So Daniel O'Connell was the founder and trustee of Prospect Cemetery, later known as Glasnevin Cemetery. He was the legal advisor to the Catholic Association, which he had founded in pursuit of Catholic burial rights. He achieved religious and civil rights for Catholics and advocated for others, so the planning for his funerary monument was always going to be of significant importance to the cemetery authorities. They had to plan a monument suited to the cemetery that would reflect his role in its foundation, but also his stature as a liberator in the minds of Irish people. The monument would have to be prominent, dominating the cemetery landscape, but also blend in with the style of the cemetery as it had developed since its foundation in 1832. Glasnevin was a garden cemetery, a planted environment, creating a pleasing landscape that people liked to visit, not just the bereaved. People liked to see the graves of famous people, read inscriptions on monuments, and admire the various types of funerary architecture and sculpture. The burial of famous people and the erection of fashionable funerary architecture added to the prestige of the cemetery and attracted other significant burials, important for the financial security of the cemetery. The most important interment in the early years of the cemetery was that of the Irish barrister and politician John Philpot Curran. He opposed the Act of Union, which O'Connell later sought to repeal. He died in London in 1817. His reburial in Glasnevin in 1837, at the expense of the cemetery authorities, helped elevate the cemetery into a national as distinct from a local or metropolitan cemetery, before the more significant burial of O'Connell in 1847. Curran was buried in a plot near the Prospect Gate in a tomb inspired by an ancient Roman tomb. The area became known as Curran Square. The high point of national mourning in 19th century Glasnevin was, of course, the burial of Daniel O'Connell. O'Connell died in Genoa in 1847 on his way to Rome. The cemetery authorities took on the responsibility and expense of the travel arrangements from Genoa, the funeral and the burial in the cemetery. Enormous crowds greeted the funeral procession. O'Connell was initially buried in a crypt in an enclosed section of the cemetery which contained underground rectangular vaults. The area became surrounded by funerary monuments forming a circle. This section of the cemetery became known as the O'Connell Circle after O'Connell's burial there, and his tomb attracted many visitors, including Prince Napoleon, the son of the French Emperor, in 1857. And just in the middle, as you can see, a dark part, the underground vaults are there. Immediately after O'Connell's burial, a meeting was held in the City Hall to plan for the erection of a monument to his memory. The committee then advertised for subscriptions. They were looking for a distinctly Irish design to commemorate O'Connell, and they chose a design by the antiquarian and artist George Petrie. The Irish antiquarians, especially George Petrie, had researched early Christian monastic sites, and Petrie published his research on early Irish architecture. He was most famous for having identified the round towers as being the work of early Irish Christian communities, a source of national pride. Petrie's design was a three-object memorial consisting of an early Irish church, a round tower, and Celtic cross on a raised platform. He reported the details of his plan to the Cemeteries Committee and the O'Connell Monument Committee in September 1851. The principal object of the three-part design was the church, the intended burial place of O'Connell. The tower and the Celtic cross were described as adjuncts. He described the proposed church in detail, the materials to be used, and how the building was to be constructed. He then described his plan for the tower using the same materials, stating that, quote, its minuter features should be in all respects essentially in harmony with those of the greater structure, so that both should appear of a uniform architectural style and of a contemporaneous erection. He then gave the proposed measurements for the tower. The tower was to be built on the south side of the church and 15 feet distant from it. Like the church, it would have a projecting basement, and its external diameter would be 15 feet, or 1/2 the breadth of the church, and its height, including its conical roof, would be 103 feet. Petrie stated that the height of the tower was chosen to give it sufficient elevation for its purpose, but not so high that it would appear the primary object, when the church was the more important structure. The Celtic cross was to be placed in front of the church doorway and some distance from it. The design was accepted, and a model was made, which appeared in the Great Exhibition in 1853. However, in the erection of the monument, Petrie's design was not followed, and the emphasis was given to the tower from the laying of the foundation stone. The foundation stone was laid in September 1854. An article in the Irish Examiner, taken from the Freeman's Journal, stated that extraordinary secrecy was observed in the making of the few arrangements necessary for the ceremony that took place, and some of O'Connell's friends were not given sufficient notice, or no notice, about the impending ceremony. Perhaps there was not universal agreement about proposed changes to Petrie's design. The newspaper reported that the monument would be erected within a large circle at the southeastern angle of the cemetery, exclusively set apart for the purpose by the Cemeteries Committee. When the monument was completed, the remains of O'Connell would be removed to the circle, and no other interments would be allowed there. It was decided that the tower would be built first, and the ground for its foundation was already dug out and prepared at the laying of the foundation stone. The tower would be 160 feet in height, and as the site was the highest in the cemetery, it would be seen for miles around. It is evident that this plan would make Petrie's design impossible to execute as he intended. A further intimation that the tower was going to be considerably higher than Petrie intended was a symbolic silver trowel used in the ceremony, on the front of which was engraved a round tower surmounted by a cross. The stated measurements of the tower were 22 feet in diameter at the base and 160 feet in height to the top of the cross. A verse to O'Connell was inscribed on the back of the trowel with a statement that was presented by the O'Connell Monument Committee. There was no doubt that the Cemeteries Committee meant to build the tower much higher than Petrie planned. However, it was never stated by the Cemeteries Committee that Petrie's design would not be completed. The committee had two objectives: to honour O'Connell, and in doing so, to promote the national importance of the cemetery through a monument appropriate for his stature. The design of the monument could not be seen in isolation from its impact on the cemetery as a whole, and the height of the monument could be seen as significant for visibility and impact. The height of a monument also signified the importance of the individual, like the obelisk raised to the Duke of Wellington in the Phoenix Park, or Nelson's pillar in the city centre. There was also precedent in Mount Jerome Cemetery, where the monument to the Under-Secretary, Thomas Drummond, 1840, is raised over the other monuments to indicate his stature and to be visible throughout the cemetery. The O'Connell monument is on a greater scale, but indicates national pride in an Irish hero. The tower was completed in 1856, and the chapel and cross had still to be executed. The delay in building the three-part monument evened the tower, could be due to financial considerations, which were real, but the altered height of the tower showed that the Cemeteries Committee had their own ideas for the monument and hoped perhaps to adapt Petrie's design for all three objects. A report in the Freeman's Journal, January 1856, gives an account of a visit to the completed tower, still with scaffolding around it. It was stated that the crypt would communicate with the vaults of a chapel to be built beside the tower. Above the crypt, the tower of chiselled granite rose to a height of 180 feet, counting from the foundation to the apex of the cross, the complete height of the tower, in fact, as it stands today, just the crypt. The mention of the proposed chapel meant that the completion of Petrie's design, in whatever form, was still being planned, but it was difficult to envisage how that would work given the height of the tower. In 1864, the uncompleted memorial became a matter of concern to the O'Connell Monument Committee planning the city monument to Daniel O'Connell. At a meeting of the committee in June 1864, a member, Mr. Derrynane, expressed concern that the ground allotted for the cemetery monument had been reduced. It was also mentioned that a vault had been created underneath the tower to receive the remains of O'Connell. Over the following months, meetings were arranged between the City Monument Committee and the Cemeteries Committee to discuss the completion of Petrie's design. The matter was finally resolved in March 1865 when it was decided that the mortuary chapel would be built outside the tower circle. The Freeman's Journal reported that the proposed chapel would be connected to the monument site by a bridge built over a circular ditch. A member of the City Committee, Mr. Crean, stated that he got the impression that there was great reluctance on the part of the Cemeteries Committee to have the new circle around the O'Connell monument disturbed. A brief report in the Cemetery Archives, March 7, 1865, merely stated that the mortuary chapel would be built outside the circle. At that stage, the Cemeteries Committee had planned a large enough mortuary chapel to serve the needs of a growing cemetery. The chapel was finally built a short distance from the tower, but not connected to the circle, in 1878. The crypt at the foot of the tower was now to be O'Connell's burial place and was prepared for his reburial. An older tomb was chosen to receive the coffin, and only Irish materials were used in its construction. The walls were decorated with national emblems and Celtic motifs and inscriptions related to O'Connell's life. There were also religious elements. The work was designed and carried out by the sculptural firm of Early and Powell's. After consultation with the O'Connell family, O'Connell's coffin was transferred to the crypt in an elaborate ceremony in 1869. There was no mention of a Celtic cross to be erected near the tower. However, the circle around the tower was part of the memorial landscape, and as the Celtic cross had become a popular funerary monument, it would undoubtedly be represented there. The Cemeteries Committee itself commissioned a Celtic cross memorial with religious iconography on the tower circle in memory of Monsignor Yore, who died in 1864. He had worked with O'Connell in the campaign for Catholic emancipation and was a trustee of the cemetery. Another great friend of O'Connell's was also buried in a vault in the tower circle. Sir John Gray was the owner of the Freeman's Journal, and his politics were in line with those of O'Connell. His achievements were illustrated in allegories on his memorial, erected by his widow. The cemetery became firmly established as a national cemetery over the more than 20 years O'Connell's tomb rested in the old O'Connell Circle. The cemetery attracted patriotic funerals, not only those acceptable to the authorities, but burials organised by the Fenian movement, which arranged elaborate funeral processions to Glasnevin. The management did not always approve, avoiding trouble with the law. However, they were happy with the conduct of one particular symbolic burial because of its peaceful nature, even prayerful. And they agreed to a plot near the tower, 1868. A simple Celtic cross was erected there by Member of Parliament John Martin, in memory of 3 young Fenians executed in Manchester as a result of a botched rescue attempt of Fenian prisoners when a guard was shot. There was strong emotion against the executions in Ireland, and Martin sought to divert that attention into support for repeal of the Act of Union. However, Fenian monuments grew up around the Manchester Martyrs Memorial. The monument erected beside it was to the memory of James Stephens, the founder of the secret Fenian organisation that evolved into the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the IRB, where the old Fenian Tom Clark rose to prominence before 1916. The outcome of the Easter Rising changed everything. The new century united the patriot dead of all backgrounds in the cemetery that is O'Connell's lasting legacy.